Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so delighted to see a sizable number of people here, listening, of course, to what I think is a very interesting, important lecture, something that needs to be understood by every one of us who's going to be involved in research and the ethics of research. And the title of this talk is Surviving the Act. And the Act refers to the Human Biomedical Research Act. You can call it a HBRA, okay? Human Biomedical Research Act, which will come into force very soon in the next few months. And in this lecture, Professor Campbell will outline the main features of the Act and discuss in detail the challenges that it presents to researchers, as well as the opportunities it provides to really make our research in Singapore world-class, right? And to bring up the quality of research. Professor Alistair Campbell is a distinguished visiting professor in medical ethics and emeritus director of the Center for Biomedical Ethics. Prior to this, he was the professor of ethics in medicine in the medical school of the University of Bristol and the director of its Center for Ethics in Medicine. He's also the former president of the International Association of Bioethics. Professor Alistair Campbell has written more than 30 books on these subjects and numerous articles. He's currently a member of the Bioethics Advisory Committee to the Singapore government and the vice chairman of the National Ethics Capability Committee established by the Singapore Ministry of Health. Please put our hands together to welcome Professor Alistair Campbell to give us a talk.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's some time since I've been on your campus, and all these buildings are new and beautiful. I'm very impressed, maybe even a little jealous, coming from another medical school, how beautiful your setting is here. I'm also delighted to have been invited to come here because it seems to me one of the really important things, especially in my field of ethics, is that we work together collaboratively, cooperatively in this area. I would have hoped for that across the whole range, but so important in biomedical ethics. And I'm fortunate to have headed up a center in Singapore, which is the only national center, so part of our funding is of course directed towards undergraduate medical education in the Yong Lin School of Medicine, but we are also receive funding from NMRC and from the Ministry of Health to develop other aspects of bioethics capacity development in Singapore and more widely in the region, which is another reason I'm very pleased that you've invited me to give this lecture today. Here's the outline of my lecture. I'm going to start with a disclaimer, which I'll come to in a minute. Then I'm divided into an overview of the HBRA. Then we'll look at the scope of the Act, at consent provisions, at waivers, at incidental findings, and then I'll draw a few conclusions. So let me begin with the disclaimer. I am not here to either defend or attack the Ministry of Health. Right? We have been closely engaged with our colleagues in the ministry in seeking to understand the Act, and I'm sure, like many of you in this room, we saw early drafts of the bill, we had a chance to comment and so on the bill. And now one of the tasks that we have been given by the ministry is to run workshops on the the Act itself, and particularly workshops for members of IRBs and the scientific community as well, because this is something that matters to all of us, whether we are on the research side, as it were, or on the ethics appraisal side, to understand what this Act is saying, what it is not saying, what its implications are for future research in Singapore. So that's my first disclaimer. I am here in a personal capacity, giving my account of the Act and the issues that I see. And I shall illustrate some of these issues with some case examples, but I'm aware that I may not have hit the right examples for you, so I'm very glad that we're going to have this period of questions and discussion where areas that I've failed to cover in this lecture are really important areas for you here in NTU. The second bit of my disclaimer is I am no legal expert. I've been asked to summarize the HBRA. I don't know how many of you have read the Act. It's quite long. It's in legalese. I may have got it wrong at times because I'm not an expert. I hope not. And you'll see towards the end of my talk, I have an acknowledgement, particularly of one of my colleagues, Sumi Menon, who is a lawyer and who has helped me try to get the legalese translated into other languages. There isn't, you'll be relieved to hear there isn't much philosophy in my lecture, which is my special language. Some philosophical issues may well arise as a result of the concerns and the opportunities that I talk about. Okay, so that's my disclaimer. So the first thing I want to do then is I just want to give a quick overview of the Act. Now here's what the Minister of State for Health said in his speech when the bill was moved in Parliament. Strong ethics governance and protection for people who are subjects of such research. That's the main aim, and this would be echoing what's in most international declarations. The emphasis is on protection of subjects of research. There are other aims, but that is the first aim correctly. But the second aim is also, this is seen as a proactive measure. Just make sure, I'm not sure which one is a pointer here, sorry. How do I do the pointer?
There you are. See? Right in the center here.
Right in the center, thank you. Yeah, so the other thing is to help Singapore maintain its reputation as a biomedical research hub of international standing. And actually, we can talk about that later, the extent to which the international reputational sides matter and how we can ensure these. Because I think that is an issue, and it's one that may come up more specifically in relation to particular aspects of the Act. So it's already been mentioned about the implementation of the Act. So the bill became an Act of Parliament in 2015, but it has not yet been implemented. The main provisions of the bill will come into force later this year. We don't know an exact date yet, but presumably around about August or sometime later in the year. But the human tissue sections of the Act will not yet be implemented. Well, the other thing that is worth mentioning is that there is also a sunset clause in the Act, if that's the correct term, which means that if you are already engaged in research which has been approved according to the previous requirements, the Act will not apply to that research. For at least 1 year, if not longer, you will not be retrospectively affected by the new Act. So, as I've mentioned already, it regulates two things: human biomedical research, and we'll see in a minute the definition of that, and research involving tissues, when this research is conducted in Singapore. It also regulates, the tissue section regulates storage and tissue banking as well as research with tissues. It prohibits certain types of research, and I'll give you some examples here, but we'll come back to that later in the lecture. But you probably did see the news of the recent human-animal combination which some researchers in the States have done, where they have injected some cells into a pig embryo, and that embryo came to maturity to 28 days. Now, that's the kind of research which is almost certainly at the moment prohibited by the Act, or it's certainly in the area of restricted research, which means that it couldn't simply go through an IRB. And the other thing that's highly relevant is draft regulations and guidance notes are to be released but are not yet released. And again, I'll be saying a bit later in my talk, actually it's very, very important that we have the regulations, because the regulations will help us understand how, in fact, the Act will apply to specific areas that you might be involved in as a researcher, or you might be considering as a member of the IRB here. The other important thing to notice is that it's separate legislation that covers clinical trials. So clinical trials are covered by the Medicines Act and the Health Products Act, and this includes both trials of medicines and trials of products, health products. There has been a revision of this legislation to try to bring it more into line with the new Act. I'm not going into that today, but the revised conditions to do with the Medicines Act and Health Products Act are available from the government side. So that's a general overview then of HBRA. But maybe more important is, what is the scope of this Act? If you are a researcher, does the Act affect you? And in what way it does? Do feel free to come in. I'm wandering around anyway, so I was told I had to wander around because this is a smart classroom, and it's smart to wander around, so I'm doing my best. It also means that I can come up to someone and ask them a question in due course. Right. Okay, so let's look at the scope of the Act. So it provides a general definition of human biomedical research, and then it has 4 categories. Research which will always fall under the Act. Research which will never fall under the Act. It's excluded from coverage. Research, I've mentioned a minute ago, which is prohibited under the Act, so you cannot perform it. And finally, research which is restricted. Now, the restricted research is research where there will probably be specialist committees set up by the ministry to look at these particular areas and to give a more detailed and expert opinion on the proposed research. So there'll be some areas of research that would not come to a standard research ethics committee or IRB. And now we come to the definition. This is a horribly complex slide, but I think it is very important. I'll show this slide several times, because this is the one that we need to keep going back to in order to understand whether the HBRA affects any particular research project. So the other thing is, you have to have Part 1 and Part 2. So if the research falls under Part 1, but it does not have any of the features mentioned in Part 2, it falls outside the scope of the Act. So then in Part 1 then, it's research designed to study prevention, prognostication, diagnosis or alleviation of any disease, disorder, or injury affecting humans. Secondly, aesthetics, restoration, promotion, or maintenance of human aesthetic appearance through clinical procedures or techniques. Or 3, human performance or endurance. That 3 is one of the trickiest bits, and we'll come back to just exactly what would be covered by the term human performance. But no research falling into any of these 3 is going to have to be dealt with by an IRB unless, in addition, one of the conditions, at least in part 2, is satisfied. So it has to be an intervention, including a willful act or omission that has physical, mental, or physiological effect. And here the bit in brackets is very important: temporary or permanent on the human. Or it uses individually identifiable human biological material, or individually identifiable health information. So although the print is rather small, I'm going to read out the bits at the bottom because they matter as well. So health information then means obtained in the course of, in connection of providing health care, or more generally relating to the study, prevention, etc. of disease. Individually identifiable in relation to the material or health information is it has to be biological material or health information that's human, and it has to be health information or other information to which the person, research institution, tissue bank, or other organization is or is likely to have access. So another of the questions that we perhaps will be talking about later is this whole question of identifiable. When is health information not identifiable? And I'm not going to talk about that now, but I'll come to it later, and we might also be interested in discussing this. It's important, of course, because if it's non-identifiable and it's not an intervention, it doesn't fall under the Act. Okay. What about prohibited research and restricted research? Well, I've chosen not to spell these out, although happy to talk to you about it later. You can see Schedules 3 and 4 of the Act that deals with this. But clearly, recent developments in human-animal combinations are relevant, and there is a report by the BAC on this, which has had influence on the way the Act was drafted. So if you wish, we can discuss this later in more detail. Now, the other way to look at this is not, does my research fall into the Act, but does the Act not cover my research? So what is specifically excluded from it? Right. So research on normal human psychological responses and behaviors are excluded if they are not intended to study psychiatric or psychological disorders, and they involve no more than minimal risk to the subject. Now, the reason the "and" is in red is that it's possible that some of these studies are potentially containing more than minimal risk. And this is another of these difficult gray areas, which you could have a proposal that is nothing to do with disorder or psychiatric disease, but subjecting people to it could cause temporary harm. Remember, it doesn't have to be permanent harm. Could cause temporary harm. So this is where we get into another of these gray areas of how do we determine whether this particular research, quite likely social science research, that kind of area, is actually more than minimal risk. And the same thing goes for research to measure human intelligence. If it involves no more than minimal risk, it's excluded. And then the small print again. So it's minimal risk is the probability and magnitude of harm and discomfort anticipated in the research, etc., either no more than is normally encountered in daily life or during the performance of routine physical or psychological examinations or tests. So the minimal harm thing is again important. And those of you who are on IRBs or may be on IRBs in the future, as well as those of you who are designing research, this is an area where there is going to have to be a judgment call about the extent to which what is being done exceeds any of these. And I think the most interesting area of this is to do with normal performance of routine physical or psychological examinations. How intrusive is the proposal? Does it have a potential for more than minimal harm? Again, remind you, even if temporary, does it have the possibility of that? The other areas that are excluded is public health research on infectious diseases, because this is covered in a different act. And as already mentioned, all clinical trials are dealt with by a different set of legislation, and also the collection of health information for epidemiological or statistical purposes is excluded from the Act as well. Okay. Let's come to our first case. All right. NIPPER, it's called. Planning for pregnancy. Well, I'm not. Although I keep getting notice asking me if I'll join, because I'm in NUS. Okay, so it's to examine the benefits of specially formulated nutritional drinks and designed to determine if healthy sugar levels can be maintained in a mother to promote the health of her baby. It starts before pregnancy, so you have to be planning for a pregnancy. Then there's an age range, which again does tend to exclude me, as well as my gender, of course. And you can see the rest here. So what's going to happen? Volunteers will be provided with the nutritional drinks, with pregnancy ultrasound scans, and they'll be reimbursed for their time and travel. Is this HBR? I'm not going to point a finger at anyone yet, but I'd like someone to volunteer an opinion. Does this fall under the Act or not? Yes, thank you.
Theoretically, yes, but it depends on the formulation in there.
Okay, depends on the formulation, so that's one question, the question of whether there's potential harm there. But the other yes from over here, because, yes. Yeah. So these are points, we'll go back to the definition in a minute. These are points which are to do with the intrusive nature of the potential harm. What about the other part of the definition? It studies gestational diabetes incidence. Therefore, it does fall under research to do with prognostication and diagnosis of disease. So even though it's a nutritional drink, it doesn't have to be a pharmaceutical product in order to fall under the Act. In fact, if it were, it might not even fall under the Act. It might be some sort of clinical trial. It's an intervention which could potentially cause some risk, and it is studying a disease. Also, the generic health outcomes may qualify. I'm sorry, let me go back. And here's a little bit of advice to you in blue. When in doubt, get an opinion, rather than thinking, oh, all we're doing is giving probiotic, whatever it is, to women. That's not risky. We don't need IRB approval. Not a good idea. If you're not sure if it falls under HBRA, you can either approach your own IRB for an opinion or indeed go to the MOH itself and ask. Because if you erroneously believe your study is not HBR and you go ahead without IRB approval, you have contravened the Act. And this is a feature of the Singapore Act that is unusual, which is the penalties are criminal. So you can be fined or go into prison for contravening the Act. We could discuss that later if you like. It's unusual, let's put it that way, that it's a criminal offense. And I know a number of people who are researchers have said to me, why did they have to have these hefty fines? Because it makes it much more hazardous. Isn't this discouraging research? But we can discuss it later. Okay. So just to reinforce then, you see that because it's studying gestational diabetes, it falls under Part 1. And because it's an intervention that we don't know for sure will or will not cause harm, it falls under Part 2. Or equally, it all depends also what is being done with the individually identifiable health information. You need to find out what is following up these women. Is this going to remain identifiable information or not? And if it is, because maybe you want another follow-up in another 5 years or something, then it's definitely under the Act again, because it's identifiable health information. Any questions at this stage? I want to go on to consent now. I think it's because I'm a philosopher. I do find legal things very boring. So I hope I'm not boring you too much. I'm trying to bring it alive, but it does matter to us that we get it right, to all of us, whether we're involved in research, ethics appraisal, or whether we're involved in ourselves conducting research, or in many cases, when we're involved in both. So let's then go on to another very important aspect of the Act, which is to do with the nature of consent. And first of all, I want to look at consent in relation to human biomedical research, because the consent for tissue is slightly different from the consent for HBR. So here it is. Now we're looking first of all at adults and adults with capacity. So of course there are separate sections on adults who lack capacity as defined under the Mental Capacity Act, and also separate sections on consent in the case of persons below the age of consent. So we start then with the adults who have mental capacity. So first of all, the general rule is the consent has to be a written document. It has to be in writing. It has to be directly either from a subject or, in the case of a mentally incapacitated person, from the donor or other appropriate person. Or I think donor here doesn't refer to the Act, it refers to the donor of tissue. After information is provided and explained, and it has to be witnessed. And then on the right-hand side, there's a list of 13 bullet points of what must be included in the information which is given. That might seem to you quite a lot, but actually it's less than in some of the documents that suggest how much should be in the information form. In the CIOMS, the CIOMS guidelines that have just recently produced, there are double this number. There are 26 separate points in an information sheet. Another interesting thing about this list is that unlike other documents and other places, the researcher is not required to give any information about how the research is funded. And that is interesting. I'm not sure why that's excluded, because it is quite commonly one of the things that is required to know what the source of funding is. This does raise other questions to do with potential conflicts of interest in relation to the researchers. Now, the Act does talk about conflicts of interest in relation to the IRB members. So if you're on an IRB, you have to declare any conflict of interest and recuse yourself from consideration of a project if you have a clear conflict in this case. But these requirements do not include any information to the participants in research about who is funding this and what the financial arrangements are with the researcher. Let's take another example here. What if the research is conducted in a way that the more subjects you recruit, the higher payment you will receive? Is that something that participants in research should be aware of or not? Well, it's not in this list. Some people would say they should be aware of it because they would want to be sure that they're not being recruited just because the individual wants to get a higher payment for the research that's being done. But the other big problem with consent, and I mean volumes and volumes and volumes of journal articles. By the way, I haven't written 30 books. I've written I've written quite a few books, but many of these are book chapters, not books. So no deception. Yeah, I think it's about 11 books. Volumes and volumes of journal articles about the problem of getting genuine consent. We know it's extremely difficult. We know that often when studies are done later, you discover that the people who are enrolled in the research have forgotten half of it and misunderstood a third of it. It is very difficult, but that in itself is not an excuse for trying to ensure, especially if there's a reasonable amount of risk involved, that the participant in research understands what's involved. And here's a very interesting little study that was done, which was called Socializing the Genome Project by a researcher in England. So Wellcome is misspelled, by the way. Should be 2 L's because it's a Wellcome Trust. So it involved discussions of groups across the country. You can see it's England from the groups. Members of a choir, a women's guild branch, a curry club, maybe it wasn't England, and parents from a London school. Yes, it was. And she asked what the words DNA, gene, and genomics meant. Okay, so it's the last bit. As for genomics, it was suggested several times that genomics probably had something to do with gnomes. All right. So I think the whole, this is an extreme example, but the whole problem of communicating with people that you want to enroll in research in a way that they fully understand what they're agreeing to is a major problem. And I think we all recognize that. However, research consent is not the signature on the form. The signature on the form is the recognition that the individual has understood the explanation and then is willing to participate. So then we come to the second area, which again I think may be relevant to researchers in this university, and that is consent involving minors. And I've just picked out this bit because this is quite distinctive for the Singapore Act, where the minor has sufficient understanding and intelligence to enable the minor to understand what is proposed in the biomedical research, consent is obtained from both the minor and at least one adult parent or guardian of the minor. I added both. That is relatively unusual. Usually the word assent is used in terms of mature minors. So of course, the law here, I'm sure you're all aware, defines a minor as anyone under 21 unless they are or have been married, in which case they then cease to be a minor. That's a bit puzzling, isn't it? That's the law. So the reality is, and especially say if you're involved in research with students, as many of you may well be, is a huge number of your subjects are going to be minors in terms of the law in Singapore. That wasn't me, no. Okay, that's all right. So the other very interesting bit about this is the second bit, where the minor has sufficient, etc., to understand. And the institutional board has waived the requirement to obtain consent of at least one parent or guardian of the minor. Consent is obtained only from the minor. So it's not only that you cannot just rely on parental consent and the assent of the minor. You should have the consent of the minor as well as of the parent. But that you're also able to argue present a case to the IRB that you do not need to get parental consent. And so this again becomes highly relevant to planning research with mature young people. However, the situations under which the IRB will give a waiver here are relatively restrictive. There isn't a lot of room for avoiding getting parental consent, even if it's an unmarried 19-year-old student. But here they are. First of all, there has to be no more than minimal risk to research subjects. So any suggestion that what you're doing contains more than minimal risk, as earlier defined, you have to get parental consent. Secondly, you must make sure it will not adversely affect, I'm sorry, there's a word missing, the rights and welfare of research subjects. That one is difficult. We'll need to get the regulations to see what that means. What situations there might be where failing to consult the parent is actually having an adverse effect on the welfare of research subjects, apart from the risk element. The third one is the one we see more commonly in various international statements. It may not practically be carried out unless a waiver is given, and the reasons would be where there's some possibility that you're discovering neglect or abuse of the minor, so you do not want to involve the parent for that reason, or where the research is into an area where the young person is unlikely to be willing to cooperate or may not give honest answers, such as sexually transmitted diseases and other areas of that kind. So you see maybe that while it is possible to, if I can use the word, bypass parental or guardian consent, the vast majority of studies, even though you have a mature minor, will have to get parental consent under the Act. So I thought I'd give you another example. I'm sorry there's a lot of text on here, but let me just read it quickly. So the purpose of the study is to determine whether intensive short-term reflex training methods on the performance of proficient amateur players of fast-paced action online games, I think I've failed already, I can't even read this, can be enhanced to the level of professional players. Okay, and then what they do is they mention the different speeds, and then how a professional player can get up to 500, 600 actions per minute. So this research wants to study 40 secondary school students who are already at the 150 actions per minute of this game, and 20 of them will be assigned to an intensive short-term training group, 20 to the control group. There'll be a 1-hour intensive reflex training program for 12 weeks. The program's online. Then after each training session, subjects will be required to practice for 4 hours per day. At the end of a 12-week period, all the students will take part in an online multiplayer competition where the APM of the participants will be measured. Does this fall under the Act? Yeah, so it could be said that this is intrusive because it's 4 hours a day. So harm of a kind of social, psychological kind could be caused. That's one possibility. What about the first part of the definition? Does it fall under the first part? Somebody? Yes, it falls under performance. So this is definitely a study of performance. And this is why the performance bit in the Act, again, to me, is extremely interesting. Because performance takes you away from the whole area of health and disease, but still defines it as human biomedical research. And of course, we get into studies of athletes and athletic performance and so on. Clearly, will fall under the Act as a result of the inclusion of performance in the criteria in Part 1. The question of whether there is harm will then be the critical question in Part 2. Whether the requirement to do 4 hours game playing a day is itself a potentially harmful activity, and if so, then it has to be at least assessed by IRB. Now this one, we've used this in other groups. This usually causes quite a lot of disagreement in the group. And so many of you may well feel, oh, come on, what's the problem? You probably play 4 hours a day anyway, or even more. And, you know, it's just a game and so on. And that's why this area is so interesting. Because the thing is, these things are not black and white. They're not obvious, some of these areas. There are areas of uncertainty, of gray, which is why we have committees. And why we need to train the committees, by the way, which my center is doing, because there are difficult judgments to be made, and there may well be disagreements among committee members about whether or not a given proposal is, one, in scope, and two, if it's in scope, whether the safeguards in it are sufficient to allow it to go ahead. So, you know, if it were some sort of permanent harm that might be caused by this would be a different question again, where the IRB might say, you'll need to design something else because this is too detrimental to these young people. Now, you could say, of course, that the parental consent is another safeguard here. So you go to the parents may well say, well, it's hard enough to get him off the laptop. There's no way he should sign up or she should sign up for this and do even more of games instead of doing her homework. And the parent will say no, but you can't guarantee that. The responsibility, if it is in scope, is very much on the IRB to try to assess, how is this risky? If so, how risky, and are there sufficient safeguards in it? Good. Tell me why.
For exactly the same reason. Because it is an intervention,
Right.
because there is a potential risk, and because you could catch or get younger people to develop bad habits.
Almost like a kind of addiction to a kind of caught up with the gaming so much that it becomes a kind of addiction. Maybe that was not what you were saying, but that's something sometimes being suggested. It's actually encouraging a behavior that itself could be difficult for them to control in the future. Yes, please.
I'm curious about the compensation that can be given to a subject in
Yes.
this sort of situation.
Yes.
Because it could be that the family is attracted by the compensation. And so formulating a project with compensation may distort
Yes.
the honesty of the request for consent.
Yes.
And it could be that the act would want to look at that and say, you are not really asking for consent because you're actually giving too much compensation.
Yeah, and this whole area of inducement is a very important area in itself. And one of the things I was about to say later, but your comment has helped me say it now, is it's not, nowhere is it mentioned in the Act. So there's nowhere in the legislation that discusses what might be, say, undue inducement because of the amounts that are being offered to participants, healthy volunteers, to participate. Now, it may come in the regulations, I don't know, or in guidance notes, which are also to come. But at the moment, it's really very much left to IRBs to ask the question, is this too much of an inducement? I thought you were also going to, when you say compensation, think about harm, where you do have to show that you can compensate for any harm caused. But it'd be hard to see in this case what that compensation would be in the other sense of compensation. Whereas physical harm, it's more obvious.
There's another sort of harm in this case, though. If it's a child who is induced to do 4 hours of gameplay, that student is not playing outside and is not studying for school. So there's actually displacement activity could be seen to be harmful.
Yep, absolutely. I think that argument could certainly be put forward. And so there's a health risk, in fact, potentially involved in this, which takes us really to the next one, smoking cessation study. All right. So in this study then, the group of, and this is a student project. By the way, these are all hypothetical examples, though they are based on actual examples. They are concerned with the addictive aspects of smoking, and they want to study the effectiveness of behavioral therapies in helping secondary school students quit smoking before they become addicted to nicotine. So they recruit by means of posters, and then they divide it so that 50 students attend a series of behavioral therapy sessions, and 6 months after the end of the therapy sessions, they're interviewed to find out whether they have ceased smoking. A further follow-up is carried out 12 months after the end of the therapy sessions. I can see quite a lot of problems in this one, some of them methodological. But let's stay with the question of, these are definitely minors in terms of the Act. So how are you going to get parental consent? Right. All right, so if you think that one through, what secondary school student is going to go back to the parents and say, I'm smoking and somebody's asked me if I take part in this session, right? Some might, I suppose, but the whole question here is almost rendered otiose by the fact that you might want, if you wanted to do this research and if you wanted to improve the methodology, from the current one, you would really have to try and get a waiver of parental consent, or you wouldn't get your subjects. And the same thing, of course, too, is the veracity of the answers over the telephone later. So it's an interesting one from the point of view of minors and the involvement of parents. Now, I'll speed up a bit because I do want plenty of time for questions and discussion. I see I've talked for quite a while, but even though I'll go a bit faster now, I'm very happy for you in questions to raise issues that I've gone across too quickly or haven't dealt with at all. So with the human tissue one then, this is not yet implemented, will not be implemented this year, but it's different, and particularly different because of certain issues which are highlighted in red. And especially here, the issue of consent is a very interesting question, because a lot of this research, you can't specify precisely for what purpose it will be done. And I'll show you a slide in a minute that shows the gradation here between very specific use of tissue for what you can do a full information form and much more general uses. There's also the question of IP rights. So again, this has been a famous case in the States about this, about the fact that once you donate the tissue and then subsequently a profit is made from something that's developed from a tissue, you have no IP rights and no financial recompense for that. And the whole question of types of research that might be used. So for example, if the tissue was later to be used in these restricted areas to do with gametes or embryos or one of those areas, it would be likely that you would have to go for further consent for that, because you wouldn't know at the time before you could have it done. And of course, the whole question of whether it will be exported is another issue. So it is another complicated one. I'll just go quickly through this gradation from less burden to less control to more burden and more control. So if you don't have to gain consent at all, you have there's no burden on either the researcher or the donor. Blanket is one where you just consent to its use in any research unspecified. Broad is where there are specified limitations and there's ongoing communications. Checklist is even more specific, where you actually can say, I'll allow this and this, but not that. And then the most specific one is study specific. So if anyone's interested in tissue, use of tissue in research, happy to come back to this in questions. Let's look now at waivers. I think this is very important to the research community, because there is a worry, I know, that the whole procedure is becoming much more bureaucratic, time-consuming, and putting in delays. So the question is, must you always get consent? The answer is no, and you'll see where there's minimal risk and where there is not much risk of the identification of a subject in the future. However, it should be noticed that it's important to note that the waiver applies only to consent being written. In other words, you can waive, you can dispense, you can get permission to dispense with the form and the signatures and the witness, but that doesn't mean you can't explain what's involved before you get verbal consent. You still have to get consent. You just don't have to have it in a written form. And then for biological material and health information, I'm sorry, I need to go back. the argument about practicality comes up. Again, no minimal risk. But D is another one of these intriguing ones, that the research contributes to the greater public good. So how high a threshold is it for you to be able to get a waiver of consent for the use of health information or tissues? Right, so this case, I won't take up time by reading it out, but basically it's the kind of study that is often done in which there's a study of health records and then a follow-up of patients in order to establish various risk factors and their effect on the subsequent outcome for the patients. Now, it could be difficult to contact all 1,822 patients or their families, so it could be argued that you should be able to use this health information without having to get written consent, in the sense that you cannot easily contact everyone. Some may be dead. The families may not be happy for you to be contacting them about their dead relative. There are various practical arguments of that kind. And this particularly affects this kind of large-scale study that involves health information, and it is not actually interfering with the patients in any sense. There's no intrusion, but there is the use of identifiable patient information. I can go quickly through the next ones. There may be people here involved in this, but just to note that the emergency research, which is a very important area of research in trauma and elsewhere, there are provisions that allow this to take place. You don't have to find a relative if you're trying something on a patient who's brought into emergency and there's a particular procedure you want to test on this patient. Patient's not competent, family cannot be contacted. If you have the protocol there and it's been approved, you can proceed with the intervention without having to get consent. The requirement then is afterwards, when the patient, and if the outcome is good, you must then later inform the patient of the reason for doing it, that they were part of a research project. There is a problem here. Again, if anyone's interested, I'm concerned about time, but you can't use this where there's already an accepted, effective intervention and you want to test it against another one. It has to be where there is currently no standard intervention that's known to be effective. So that does limit the number of emergency trials that you could do if already there is what's regarded as a reasonably effective intervention and you cannot get consent. Now here's another one to me very interesting. I'm sorry, back we go. Vulnerable populations is quite commonly mentioned in various international documents, but it is not in the HBRA. It is, however, in the BAC, and they give these following examples: prisoners, uniformed personnel, especially junior ranks, patients, especially if the researcher is their attending physician, employees, junior collaborators, or students. Lots of them here in the campus, in the room as well. Now here there is, in the BAC, there is a requirement that normally the person gaining consent should not be part of the hierarchical relationship. So a junior person in the uniformed services should not be asked for consent by a senior officer. And similarly, the whole question of students and students' relationship to the teachers who then want to do research on the students is drawn into question by this. However, I mention this out of interest. HBRA does not mention it. So you can carry on doing what you like with your students. That was a joke, right? All right. Incidental findings, there again is an interesting divergence here. What HBRA says is that you have to decide ahead of time whether or not you are going to reveal any relevant incidental findings. If you've decided that, then you have to get the permission of your subjects to convey these findings to them. But if they refuse, then you have no obligation to do so. But this is different from the guidelines which the BAC has in its document. They say if there is a possibility, then they should be given a choice during the consent process prior to the commencement of research. The difference is this requires you, if you think it's likely to be an incidental finding, that you do actually have this in the information and ask the patient whether, should there be such a thing, they wish to be informed. So HBRE gives the researcher discretion whether to include them. He doesn't need to raise, or she doesn't need to raise the possibility if they don't want to include it in the information. We've no time for the case, but we can come back to it if you like. So let me sum up then with my last few slides. First of all, is Singapore out of line here? I suppose I'm in a position to give an opinion on this since I've been involved in research ethics in several different countries, in New Zealand, briefly in the States, in Britain, and here in Singapore. So I think the short answer is these are pretty well in line with what would be accepted international requirements these days. The difference is the scope of the Act, whereas in some other countries you find a mixture of different acts at different times. This is a more comprehensive coverage of the whole field than you often see. And I suppose you can say you have consistency as a result of that. So as I said, it conforms to established international standards. Declaration of Helsinki, I'm sure well known, but the CIRMS guidelines, however, as already mentioned, the guidelines issued by CIRMS require a lot more detailed information than is in the Act. And the dual consent, as opposed to consent and assent procedure for vision minors, is distinctive. So, how do we survive the Act? Well, the first thing to say is, I think it is very important that all research in this category in Singapore is going to be properly ethically scrutinized. I don't think the concerns were about the major research institutions who have already operated with IRBs. I think the concerns is this actually covers everyone who's doing research if it falls under the Act, whatever institutional affiliation they have or whether they're in a private enterprise. It covers everything. That does seem to be a definite plus in having such comprehensive legislation. But the Act should not be an impediment to worthwhile research. And that's the other side of the picture. So I think a continuing dialogue about how the Act is actually affecting research, how researchers themselves see it, and whether, in particular, when we get to the detailed regulations, this is proving to be problematic from the point of view of promoting research. That is terribly important. That's what I mean about surviving the Act. We actually have to be active in relation to the Act in terms of beginning to see its implications and to feed these back. Because the devil is in the detail. There have to be clear regulations and guidelines. This is crucial for researchers. It's also crucial for IRBs, because IRBs are going to be tasked with making some rather difficult judgment calls in these gray areas that I've talked about. So finally, my acknowledgement, I mentioned already Sumi Manon for the use of some of the slides, and also her, both her and Owen Schaefer. I'll not embarrass him by pointing out where he's sitting in the room, for assistance in clarifying the issues and also finding appropriate case examples. And just a little add at the end, we will be holding 2 workshops on the regulations which are currently drafted by the ministry. And if you go to the centers.sg, that's the website, you will eventually find details of this. Also, if you go to centers.sg, you can then register to be on our mailing list, which means automatically you receive notice of future meetings. Please, questions and comments. Thank you very much.
I'm sure it's an introduction to a very difficult topic for most of us here. It's a new topic since we just got a new medical school, but we have always been conducting research in NTU. So I'm sure that there are many questions, so we'll take questions from the floor. Yes. Okay, hold on. Before that, may I just tell you that in the center of every table, there is a microphone. So you pick it up, and then you just have to press that button, and it's on. Yep. Press it, press it.
Press. Okay. Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. My name is Udi. I'm from material science, actually.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, relating to the definition of identifiable material. Mm-hmm. So identifiable information is one thing, okay? These are records being kept. Mm-hmm. But identifiable material is a very broad definition. Cells, even if they were obtained anonymously, tissues, the same thing. You can, if you want to, trace back the DNA
yes.
composition and then go back and trace the person.
Yes.
Particularly in the age of biometric information, right? So I was wondering, where does the border lies in there?
Well, this is the trouble. It's very difficult to know where the borderline is, because you're absolutely right that increasingly the idea of total anonymization with no prospect of ever then identifying an individual is really rapidly disappearing. So then we come to intent as opposed to possibility. So in other words, while it might be that you could re-identify the source of a piece of material, which now we have a DNA and so on, if you deliberately use techniques to find that person without knowing whether or not that person had consented to being followed up, then you're in breach of the act. So, yeah, if you really determined, I understand, and you're probably more of an expert in this than I am, if you're really determined, you could actually dig down and get to a point where you're pretty sure it's this individual. The question is, do you intend to do that? Do you attempt to do that or intend to do that? If you intend to de-identify, to re-identify, I'm sorry, then you're in breach of the act.
Yes, Jan.
So it was a very interesting presentation. Very good, thank you.
Thank you, Jan.
I didn't actually find so much that differs from the principles that we have today. The main difference is that it's an act. But I did see one big difference, and that is that for informed consent, you have to have a witness,
yes.
which you don't have today. And who will qualify as a witness? Because usually, when you get informed consent, it is in the research environment or the environment of the researcher. And the other issue is, if you're carrying out research in Singapore on material collected outside of Singapore, where you often are getting informed consent in a different structure, how is that going to work?
Okay, the second one is the easier one to answer than the first. Okay, so the second one is actually specified in the Act. which is that if you're using material from outside Singapore, all you have to do is satisfy yourself that the requirements in that country have been met. So material brought in from another country does not have to satisfy the requirements of the Singapore Act. The first one is much, well, the answer is we do not know, because again, it will have to be in regulations. It's mentioned that every signature must be witnessed, but there's no specification of who the witness is, and whether there are any excluded individuals from being witnesses. So we simply don't know the answer to the first question. But it is required.
Yes,
Several hands, yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. You made quite a difficult topic a bit clearer.
Thank
I just want to ask about do you have any more details about the exemptions for infectious disease research of public health importance?
Basically, the short answer to that, as I understand it, is that it's almost certainly all under the Infectious Diseases Act rather than under this act. Am I correct? He doesn't know. Okay. I'm fairly sure that I think you better look it up, because I think I'm in danger of giving you the wrong answer. So there could be areas where your research is in the area of infectious disease, but it is actually also covered under HBRA rather than under the requirements of the Infectious Disease Act. So I don't know the answer.
I think it's a bit grey, that's why
Yes, right.
I was hoping you could
No.
shed a bit more light on it.
Maybe ask the minister the question instead. They should
Yes.
have the answer.
So in some outbreak situations, there is a grey line between what is kind of public health
Yes.
procedures of importance, as well as conducting research that may be useful if the so-called outbreak goes on to be a real, what they call epidemic kind of proportion. So I don't think it's been as clear as it can be or should be.
I can only repeat my advice at the very beginning of a lecture, which is, if you're unsure, the best thing to do is to get an opinion on it, probably from the ministry rather than sending it to your IRB, which may not know the answer.
Jan, you have questions?
Yeah, you gave a couple of examples that were student projects,
Yes.
and these are quite often the ones that cause most headaches at the IRB.
Yes.
Now these will be covered by the Act,
Yes.
which makes individuals responsible. Who is responsible in the case of student projects? Is it the student, or is it the supervisor, the teacher?
Well, first of all, it has to be, there has to be an identified research institution, RI, under the Act. Okay. So presumably, let's say they are students from this university, then the RI would be Nanyang Technological University. So the first thing is the university itself will be held liable for failure to have appropriate ethical scrutiny of projects that fall under the Act. The next likely responsible person would not be the student, but the supervisor of the student. Because one has to presume, unless the student is just left to make up any research protocol she or he wants, the student actually has been given this as an assignment by someone else. So in that rather loose sense, the PI is actually the academic who is overseeing and marking the research project. There's an area of huge debate in Britain when I was still there, and continues to be. It's very difficult because you want students to learn the techniques of research, but one really has to be very cautious in terms of what areas of research it's appropriate for a student to carry out. So the smoking one, to me, is a good example. No way should that be a student project, even if it's okay in other ways. There are just too many difficult aspects of that for it to be student work.
Yes, Dean?
You mentioned among the research which is prohibited under the HBRA, the area of human-animal hybrids or chimeras.
Yes.
Am I right in guessing that transgenic animals do not apply to this? So in other words, animals where you need to express human genes in a mouse in order to study a certain disease?
Yeah, I'm fairly sure they're exempt. I'm neither a lawyer nor a scientist, so I could have my answer wrong with this one. I mean, this has been done for many years, this kind of research.
Indeed, yes.
And I don't believe that the area of restricted research, well, it may be in restricted research, but I'm sure it's not in prohibited research. Yeah, good question, and I'll chase up on it because I'd like to have a clear answer, but I'm fairly sure that's the answer.
Thank you.
Yes, Paul? Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, Annabelle?
Thank you very much for a very elucidating lecture. And it's really interesting that you brought out the point about the difference for incidental findings for our present the present practice and HBR. I'm just wondering, what's the rationale that HBR has for allowing the researcher to make the decision to not disclose that incidental findings could be a possibility, and how would the researcher, or what would be a plan? I mean, if there is an incidental finding and such an event is not disclosed, the researcher could be put in a dilemma on how to deal with the situation. Just wondering, what was the rationale and what guidelines are there?
Well, this is a hot topic, let's put it this way, and the ministry is continuing to consult on this, in fact, because I think at the moment they're not sure whether they've got the incidental finding right, the guidelines. The problems, there are a lot of problems. One is researchers are not themselves necessarily clinicians, and even if they are clinicians, the possibility of it being a significant finding is not one that they may be qualified to determine. So some arguments say you can't hold researchers responsible for failing to disclose something where they're not experts in disclosing it. That's one of the difficulties. The other difficulty is the whole question of the danger of false positives, of raising inappropriate anxiety in people, which, again, when is it significant? I mean, this idea, so usually the guidelines say it should be clinically significant in some sense, but what does that mean? And, how accurate is it? So it's an area of continuing debate, not only in Singapore, by the way, but everywhere. I know a lot about biobanking because I was chair of the Ethics and Governance Council of UK Biobank when it was first set up. And at the beginning, the biobank in Britain said, we return nothing. I mean, it's volunteers, okay. So if you want to volunteer in the bank, fine. We'll tell you what your blood pressure is and what your BMI is, because we're doing that when you first get there. After that, no information of any kind will be returned. And if you don't want that to happen, you want to get information, we're the wrong people. We're not going to return it. Just don't sign up, right? That was pretty straightforward until they've been steadily modifying the different tests they've done, and one was a brain scan. And all of a sudden, the biobank woke up to the fact that actually some very serious things could emerge. Some life-threatening things could emerge, and they had said, we're not going to tell you anything about anything. And so they had to revisit their incidental findings policy. And it is in these areas where the you can reasonably predict that apart from what you're doing in the research, the methods you're using, whatever it is, may well reveal something else. That's the area where many people would say there actually should be an obligation rather than just a permission. Why they took what might be seen as the easier route, I don't know, but it may change in the future.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. Any more questions? Okay, if not, oh, sorry, excuse me, yep.
Hi.
Press the button.
I have a question about obtaining tissue samples from commercial source.
Yes.
I think in the early draft of the act, it makes it illegal basically in Singapore to obtaining tissue sample from commercial source even overseas. Are those terms still in the act?
Yes.
So we are not allowed to purchase samples from like US companies?
I'm just checking I've got the document here, but I'm fairly sure that there can be no commercial dealings in human tissue under the Act.
See, so even the samples are obtained from overseas company.
Yeah, I got the wrong one. I'll try and find the right clause for you when I find my copy of the Act. Seem to have lost it.
Alistair, can I just
Yes.
chime in here?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, so just a note about the commercial sales. It wasn't mentioned, but the one part of the Act that is currently in force, over here, actually, the one part of the Act that is currently in force is this prohibition on commercial sales and importation of tissue. But there is an exemption, so ministry will allow reimbursement for the reasonable expenses incurred by the provider of the tissue. So money can change hands, but it has to be that every kind of dollar that is spent to purchase the tissue has to be going towards some reasonable expense, like transportation, like storage, and something like that. So if you are purchasing tissue, you need to make sure that your invoices has line item justifying how every single dollar is spent and how it's all simply reimbursement for the expenses incurred to transport, store, et cetera, the tissue. And if there is a sort of some profit margin, that's not going to be permitted.
Does that help, sir? Does that help? Yeah. Thank you. That was Owen Schaefer, whom I thanked earlier, by the way. Yeah, thank you, Owen.
Any last questions? If not, can you put your hands together? We thank Professor Campbell for a good lecture, and on behalf of the medical school, I'd like to give.
Thank you very much. Do you want to put that photo in?